It is August 5th, and we are privileged to have James Frith of Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Why don't you first introduce yourself? And a lot of people know Bloomberg and Bloomberg NEF, but it's always good to quickly summarize what you're doing kind of like in the EV space broadly and what you do specifically.
So I'm James Frith. I head up the energy storage team at Bloomberg NEF. That team focuses on the technology side of the storage industry. So a lot of our time is spent looking at lithium-ion batteries, but we also look at other storage technologies, whether that's flow batteries or kind of emerging technologies for the stationary storage space like gravity storage. Today we're going to be speaking on lithium-ion batteries, talking about the technology trends that we see coming there, the impact on raw materials. More broadly, BNEF as a whole covers the energy transition. The teams that I work with look kind of quite specifically at the power sector and the transport sector. So we have everything from raw material supply and demand up with our metals and mining team down to electric vehicle forecasts and stationary storage forecasts with our advanced transport team.
It's a fast-moving world. We expect some shakeouts and some clear trends hopefully going to emerge in battery chemistries for electric vehicles. This year we've seen in China a pivot away from mid-nickel to high-nickel cathode or LFP, so it's one way or the other. I saw a very nice slide in terms of your detailed breakdown of chemistries for, I presume it was for passenger EVs.
There's two things happening at the moment. We almost, in some respects, have more clarity on the kind of chemistries that we can expect in the market going forward over the next kind of decade or so, because we have automakers releasing their long-term roadmaps where they're actually kind of specifying chemistries these days. But on the other hand, there's a lot of uncertainty, particularly in the next couple of years, over which different vehicle segments are going to sell the most, and therefore, are we going to have more LFP in the market or more high nickel chemistries in the market? If we, I guess, kind of take a step forward to 2030, 2035, I think one thing is clear. By that point, we have upfront price parity between all kind of passenger electric vehicle segments. Slightly easier to kind of understand how the market will be split. And the way that we see it at Bloomberg NEF is that around a fifth of the market on a gigawatt hour basis will go to entry-level chemistries, if we like. So LFP particularly, where low cost is the main driver. Then you have around a third of the market, which will be the kind of volume segment. And this is where you need to get that balance between performance, so range specifically, charging rates as well, and cost. And really the leading chemistries that we see for that at the moment are manganese-rich chemistries. And there's a variety out there that may come to fruition. I think lithium nickel manganese oxide is probably one of the most well-known ones. It's a spinel material that has a high voltage plateau, so hard to integrate at the moment because you need new electrolytes, but we expect that could start entering the market in the next kind of 4 or 5 years or so. But you can also have manganese-rich varieties of the common NMC. So we think those type of manganese, kind of heavy manganese dominant chemistries will occupy, as I say, around a third of the market in that volume segment. And then the rest of the market will go to the high performance chemistries where really kind of range is the main driver and charging rates, etc. And for those, for that segment, we expect that it's going to be high nickel that is at the forefront of the market. Now, I just want to kind of clarify quickly here that I'm talking on a kind of gigawatt hour basis. And the reason I mentioned that is because if you look at EV sales on a kind of vehicle sold basis, in China in the first quarter of this year, around a third or a little over the market, a little more than the market, a third of vehicles sold used LFP, but not quite a third of the market used on a gigawatt hour basis was LFP. And that's because the kind of highest selling EV was the Huanggang Mini, which uses LFP, but it only has a 14 kilowatt hour battery pack. So although the kind of, there's loads of these battery packs going onto the road, actually there's more vehicles with larger packs, kind of 50, 60, 70, or even 100 kilowatt hours out there that are using NMC. So on a gigawatt hour basis, although you may have more vehicles with LFP, the share doesn't necessarily end up being split like that. I think that's an important distinction that a lot of people overlook.
And that is, and we agree, we say it's about the cells, not the sales. That's our tagline. So we're with you. And if I'm not mistaken, the Wuling, the 13.8 kilowatt hours, the big battery pack, there's a 9 one as well. So, and that brings us into, along those lines, is if you look at today's announcement from the Biden administration targeting 40 to 50% EV penetration in the US, those, most of the vehicles have inordinately large battery packs. A lot of them, I mean, you could, a lot of it's 100 or even higher. I mean, the Rivian, the base pack, I think, is 130 or 135, and the longer range is 180. So we really are talking, bigger. So I guess with that announcement, it's going to be a tough target, because I think as far as battery metals are concerned, 2025, it's kind of already baked in. I don't know, unless a project is already up to, regardless of whether it's lithium or nickel, unless it's already funded and planning, construction, you're not going to add to the 2025 production numbers. So it's going to be tough, but 2030, I guess we have time. Would this announcement sort of reinforce or even skew your projections further, with those sort of numbers?
Going to the US, everything has to be bigger. And I think we're going to see that with battery packs. And these are going to be high performance packs using that kind of nickel-based chemistry. So that will kind of really skew it compared to those 13.8 or 9 kilowatt hour packs in China. As to the Biden announcement, that will skew it by 2030. In our long-term electric vehicle outlook, about 25% of the US market we expect to be EV. So obviously, with the announcement from the Biden administration pushing it up to 50%, that's obviously going to have a large impact on both battery demand in the US and, as you say, kind of raw material demand. And while you say, kind of 2025 is baked in, if projects aren't kind of moving along yet, it's a bit too late. But we will start to see, I would expect, kind of an uptick in adoption starting from 2025 if you want to meet that 2030 target, because you can't just go from kind of 10% in 2029 suddenly to 50% in 2030. So there'll need to be some planning there. The thing that I would just caution at the moment, and hopefully this changes, but is that it is just a target. So until we see some legislation to back it up, I don't think we would BNEF kind of change our forecasts, because we need to see the kind of action on the ground. From a consumer's perspective, it's hard to see why many people would be going out in 2030 and buying an an ICE anyway, just because the economics of EVs will be so favorable and performance will be so good.
And that was about the point I was about to raise with you. So if everything is from an economics and a total cost of ownership perspective superior before then, and then of course the other thing as well is in countries where you have a hard cutoff in new ICE sales. So in other words, let's say it's 2035, why would you buy an ICE vehicle in 2030 when they're going to discontinue them in the future, and the running cost of a 5-year-old car in 2035 as a second-hand car will be hugely inferior, I would assume, by then to an EV.
It's a great point, and I think this becomes harder to pick apart from an analytical standpoint, because it comes more down to consumer choice. And I'm sure there will still be people out there who are very much in favor of internal combustion engine vehicles for whatever reason. I think you're right that when you start to look at kind of the impact down the line, if you want to, as you say, kind of resell that vehicle, or even if the number of kind of mechanics out there that can actually fix something if it goes wrong is reduced, it pushes you away from that kind of vehicle segment and pushes you towards EVs. In the UK, we're already seeing kind of government programs that are set up to retrain mechanics to deal with electric vehicles. We're talking kind of 15 years time before we get to the point where we have an ICE phase out. But by that point, most mechanics will be proficient with electric vehicles. And, you know, if I was a new mechanic getting into the business, 18, 19 years old, in 2030, 2032, you're not going to learn about an internal combustion engine vehicle because it's EVs that are going to be on the road. So I think it's a great point you phrased.
Well, just anecdotally, James, and it really is, but literally, I have not seen an advert for an internal combustion engine car since I've been in the UK. I've been in hard lockdown for 11, or whatever, how many days I've been here, and literally I only see electric vehicle adverts.
And that's a great point as well. You know, I think that's something that I've started to notice, that you just don't see companies advertising internal combustion engine vehicles going forward, or at the moment, and I can't see that happening going forward because of the public perception around the environment and sustainability. And we know that there's a reason that automakers spend so much on their advertising. It's because it works. So if they continue to pump money into their EV advertising, you know, again, I imagine that consumers will be more attuned to buying an EV.
Definitely, that's what I've noticed. And now, just going slightly back to the economics, and this is the question around battery pack. You guys have always had, you know, the annual, you know, the reduction of where we've come from and where we're going to. My belief is, rightly or wrongly, is if you can get the battery pack price down to $60 to $75 per kilowatt hour, you can electrify everything. It makes sense. So LFP is not far from that. I mean, I think if you were to do it in scale, whereas I keep seeing and market players are saying they're going to, on a cost and performance basis, the high nickels are going to compete, and, you know, it'll be very competitive going down the line. Do you still see that as the case, given where raw material prices are at for the high nickel side of things?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a great question, and I think it's one that probably, again, needs that you need the perspective of time. You know, certainly at the moment, those kind of key materials going into high nickel chemistries or nickel-based chemistries are increasing, and that is going to put pressure on manufacturers, automakers, and cell manufacturers. But in general, you know, we expect that the kind of price spikes that we'll see to be short term. So we might see a year or you know, slightly longer where we have high prices, but then we'd expect the prices to kind of return to you know, the average price that will help support the industry in expansion, but you know, and give them a reasonable margin. But we wouldn't expect prices to kind of, you know, stay at all-time highs for, you know, 2 or 3 years in a row. So although we might see some kind of short-term squeezes, over the long term, by the time we get to kind of 2030, etc., we expect that there will be kind of new supply that will have been brought online and stimulated by those periods of high prices, and that will kind of help to reduce some of the kind of cost constraints on these high nickel chemistries. But I think we also need to look beyond just the commodity prices themselves. If we look at the cost of the cathode active material today, around 50% of that cost is the raw materials, but you're then looking at another 50% on top of that, that is the processing fee and the margin that the kind of producer is adding on top of that. So we're starting to see cell manufacturers already reducing that somewhat. So we're seeing more in-house production of cathode material. So that's reducing some of that margin. And I expect that over the next couple of years, we'll start to see more or changes to the processing technique and technology that will help to reduce the cost of going from your kind of nickel salts, cobalt salts, lithium salts to your cathode active material. And so I think that will help to reduce the difference in kind of material price or between cathode material price between LFP and those high nickel chemistries. Okay. But yeah, I think you know, on top of that, manufacturing processes as well will have to improve.
In a nutshell, the thesis of high nickel competing on a cost and performance basis is still sound.
Being competitive, you know, I don't think high nickel will ever get down to the price of lithium iron phosphate. Lithium iron phosphate will probably always be that bit lower. but that will be countered by the the higher performance of the nickel-based chemistry.
Yeah, that's what I mean. The trade-offs, but it's still good. One thing I've noticed is that carbon footprint of everything is coming up now, and we've seen offtake deals signed in the lithium world, and I'm sure other things are going to come up. Our client Talon with nickel, they're looking for a low or zero carbon nickel product and so on. How important will that be on the battery cell manufacturing side? Because I've flagged this up. So LFP has a use case and a cost case, but the CO2 footprint of an LFP cathode and cell manufactured in China is not the same as Northvolt and FREYR and these other battery cell plants that are going to come up in Europe that are looking to be zero carbon. Now, carbon's rising, the tax is rising. I have a feeling, looking at the way this is shaking out, that carbon's going to be a hot market in the years to come. Is there a risk at some point that Europe just says no to LFP coming out of China? You've got to make it in Europe, and then it's a different price, different processes, different protocols, different criteria to meet to set up an LFP factory ex-China. Does that level the playing field? And do you see people like FREYR and Northvolt and so on as being strategic because they've got the natural sort of advantage in where they're located and what they're going to produce?
So I know FREYR well, and know 24M's technology well as well. And yeah, I've got to say, kind of from a technology standpoint, I'm a huge fan. It's an elegant technology. The processing should be much simpler. That makes it more environmentally friendly and it reduces the cost. As the kind of comparisons between FREYR and other companies, I think it's interesting because it's probably the first time we've seen commercial production or the scaling up of a completely new manufacturing process. And most of the emerging cell manufacturers that we have in Europe, whether it's Northvolt, Britishvolt, ACC, Verkor, they're really just looking at kind of getting the technology that's on the ground today out there and building at mass, large scale. Whereas if FREYR can kind of implement it and they can kind of have a step change in the costs and performance, I think that gives them an advantage. The carbon emissions associated with battery manufacturing, that's a key focus of the European battery directive, is making sure that the batteries that are going into electric vehicles are sustainable. By 2024, manufacturers will have to provide information on the carbon footprint of those cells. By 2027, there'll be standards brought in that they'll have to meet, and then they'll be ranked on a kind of A, B, C, D basis, which for those not in Europe, that's how electrical appliances are ranked today, on how kind of energy efficient they are. So we'll see a similar ranking system for batteries, and part of that is to help consumers when it comes to deciding what EV to get. Emissions associated with producing LFP in China are high today. In the stationary storage market, currently our expectation is that by 2030, around 50 to 60% of the market will be LFP. One of the reasons for that is because China will account for around a third of the market, say. So, and all of China really today in stationary storage uses LFP, but we're seeing LFP demand grow outside of China. So we expect around 50% of storage deployments outside of China will be LFP, and the rest will be kind of other nickel-based chemistries, but probably not as high nickel as we're seeing in the passenger EV sector. So the comments Elon Musk made around 2/3 iron, 1/3 nickel, we're seeing something similar, not quite that extreme, because we expect the stationary storage market to be smaller. At Tesla's Battery Day, Musk expects the stationary storage market to be kind of similar in size to the passenger EV market, if I remember correctly. So if he's saying 2/3 of demand iron and 1/3 nickel, if all of that stationary storage market is lithium iron phosphate, that means that around half of the, or a little under half of the passenger EV market will be iron phosphate, and the rest will be kind of nickel rich. So not that dissimilar from what we're saying, perhaps slightly more bullish on the LFP side of things, but not significantly so.
James, so CATL had a sort of a launch or an announcement on sodium ion. Put up a nice spider web there, like Albemarle does. Essentially everything other than energy density against LFP looked promising. I think 160 watt hours a kilo was their number versus 170. They're targeting 200. Got some feathers ruffled in terms of that announcement, but to be honest, I don't see it as a threat to lithium ion. I think the demand is so big. If you look at battery mega factory targets by 2030, there's just enormous demand everywhere. I actually see it as something positive because it can take care of possibly the low end of the market on energy storage if they can make it work. What are your thoughts?
Yes, I'd actually agree with you here. I think the entrance of sodium ion into the market is a good thing because, as you say, it can help relieve some of those supply constraints with key materials. You know, if we're in a year where lithium prices are very high and you're building, say, a stationary storage project and you're looking for a lower cost solution, you have sodium ion there where energy density isn't too much of an issue. And I think that actually touches on a wider point that I didn't mention earlier, but, you know, I think in the EV industry now, we have so many kind of options for chemistry, for cell design, for etc. Suppliers that actually it just helps build resilience. That if there's a shortage of a particular material or if there's kind of supply constraints, it makes it that little bit easier to kind of switch to make things a bit more commoditized. And obviously, if you're an automaker, you can't just go from one manufacturer to another. But if you're a stationary storage developer or in those kind of, should we say, swing applications, it gives you that resiliency. But yeah, generally with sodium ion, I think it is a good thing for the industry. It can help to relieve some supply constraint for lithium. I think it makes sense for stationary storage. The thing, and I've got to admit, I was on holiday when the announcement came out and I'm still catching up on stuff, so I haven't watched the entire video. But I think, there was this talk of having AB type battery packs where you have lithium ion phosphate and sodium ion to kind of balance performance and cost. And I think that's really interesting, but we've seen kind of automakers talking about this in the past, right? We've seen this discussion around mixing LFP cells with nickel-based cells. And it's difficult because the BMS has to adapt to the different voltage regimes and you have to kind of make sure that everything balances. So it's certainly not in my books, it's not a certainty. That being said, I think if any company was going to succeed at it, it's probably somebody like CATL, just because they have, so many people researching this stuff, and they have the kind of networks to get automakers to adopt it. But yeah, I'm more bullish on its use in the stationary storage market, certainly.
I'd agree with you. I'd say it would be a success if it could alleviate and I guess let LFP redeploy into the EV sort of market more and I guess have some of it. The cycle life and everything looks like it is suitable for ESS, so we shall see. Okay.